a new episode of Film Streak. My name is Rob. I'm watching some new movies. Actually, they're not new. They're kind of old. But the idea is these are some movies that I've not quite seen before. Now, specifically The Expendables. This is a film franchise that I think when the first film came out, a lot of people were probably right to assume that we really didn't need these films. To think that Sylvester Stallone was going to head this team of, I guess you could say, has-been action stars, even though they weren't, right? That first film, I mean, you had Dolph Lundgren, you had Jet Li, and you had the guest appearances from Schwarzenegger and Bruce Willis. And so you could say, well, this is a way to just, throw back to a different era of filmmaking. And I think those films, especially the first one, I think it really does do a good job of giving us that sense of this is fun, this is kind of badass, and it just feels real. There's a sense of humor to it, the banter that the guys have, especially Stallone and Jason Statham. You really get a sense like these guys know each other in a way. I think that kind of thing, it actually works, The problem is, though, it's still in the same vein of big, dumb action movie, and that's the thing that I think we left behind in, maybe the mid to late 90s. Like that really kind of went out of fashion, and for the most part, probably with good reason. A lot of those movies that, especially in the 80s, when they hadn't quite figured it out, I think you could see like there was a lot of not good work that was being done. And it was all under the umbrella of, it's one of these films, you're not really supposed to think too hard. And I got to say, The Expendables, the first film, for what it is kind of that too. Like, it's not really that important who the bad guy is, even though Eric Roberts here is doing some work. But, the actual circumstance of why they're in this situation and why they have to take on this bad guy and the whole conflict there, it's not really that crucial that you like latch onto it, I think the bigger thing is getting to know these characters. And I guess especially Barney and Christmas, which are just strange names, I think, for someone who looks like Stallone and someone who looks like Statham. I'll tell you what, though, one thing about the first film, at least, and I'm surprised it didn't really carry over into the others, is as kind of dumb and clumsy and just loud as those films are, in the first film, there is something about the presence of Mickey Rourke. And he's only in the film for, I think, 2 scenes. But the scene, especially where he's telling a story about his past, and it's one of those things that reminds you of like, oh yeah, here's a real actor. And, hey, look, Mickey Rourke looks how he looks. He's had a rough time of it. But underneath that's a real actor there, I think. Yeah, there's a guy there that you can't really fade him in terms of bringing it, I can't really say Stallone ever gets there. I don't really think Statham ever gets there. A lot of the actors in this film, that's not their focus. That's not their history as performers. They don't really go to those depths. And yet the 2 or 3 scenes or whatever that Mickey Rourke is in, I'm like, okay, I'm in it. I'm here with this guy. So it's weird. It's like you have one actor here who really brings some A game to it for only a few minutes. And now look, and you have Eric Roberts, and he's the bad guy. And I feel like for most discussions, he's a real, like a qualified actor. Even though he's been in a lot of questionable work over the years, but here he plays a bad guy and it's kind of one note, doesn't really get a lot of good stuff to work with. But I think that's something that these kinds of films, either they're just going to ignore it. They're just going to act like that's not a thing that we care about. or they really go far into it. And I think you see that even today, you see that in more recent films where you've got the kind of cookie cutter action plot and characters and the tropes and all that. But as soon as you have like a real actor step into something and just they bring a whole new weight to everything, you know? I mean, I think the most notable example that I can think of off the top of my head, and I know it's not a very recent film, but Mission Impossible 3, where you already know the template for those movies, but you get a bad guy like Philip Seymour Hoffman, and he takes that film to a whole nother level, right? It's like you really are scared of this guy. And here, you know, we don't get that from the bad guy in Expendables, but we get just little touches of it. Like there is more, there's another gear. We see the other gear, but we never really get there, you know? Our main cast doesn't really go into that territory. I think for this film also, a standout. So the Expendables, I remember seeing it in the theater. And it was so long ago now, I kind of really forgot most of it. But seeing it again, it recalled in my mind the moment when Terry Crews comes up with that automatic shotgun it's like in the last action sequence in the movie. And he's just blasting everybody, just like annihilating all these bad guys. I remember that was like a legit like audience moment. Like that was, you heard like cheers, like laughs, like just a visceral reaction of like, whoa, what is this guy doing? And so to me, that's a moment that sticks. And it even watching it again, it still kind of works because it's like, oh, this is a bad situation we're in. And then this guy shows up and just tears the room up. And it's brutal, it's graphic, but at the same time, it's also kind of, strangely, it's kind of comedic, you know? And so I think in the bigger picture, this kind of a film, it doesn't really do a lot for me. If you wouldn't look at it from the perspective of like an action film, I think that genre itself, especially with this kind of like mercenary special teams sort of squad type of thing, those films have even evolved and become more sophisticated over the years. That this, even though it was more recent, it wasn't in the 80s or 90s, it does feel like those kinds of films, like from that era. And I think, look, if that's what it was set out to do, then mission accomplished, you know? Now I got to say though, when you move to the next film or the rest of the films in the series, I think we start to see like the diminishing returns though. The Expendables 2, they switch up some of the cast. We have a whole different plot going on. And yet they still try to find a way to hook into that same vibe, you know, their banter together, their chemistry together. I think they're still sort of locked into it. But I think switching things up in terms of the crew itself, it could be good in terms of resetting some things of like, that didn't work in the last film, so let's try this. That's fine. But it's hard to kind of see these guys as the same group when they're not. And it just changes up the dynamic between these characters. And if that's all you really have to go on, because who cares about the plot in this movie? I think that gets tricky. You know, you get into weird, shaky territory. And in this, The Expendables 2, I honestly don't really remember the plot of it. It's not that important. You know, you do have some new appearances, some new people added to the cast. You've got Chuck Norris shows up. You've got Jean-Claude Van Damme shows up. Arnold and Bruce Willis show up again. They have a little more to do in this film. This feels like, well, here are a couple attempts at some things we didn't quite land in the first one, and we're going to try it again. And I think this one just doesn't really work the same. It doesn't feel as fresh, even though it's meant to be a throwback thing. It doesn't feel as novel of an idea now. And so, I don't know. I don't find this one as entertaining, at least, as the first movie. Now, I got to say this, though. The Expendables 3, it does something different. Also switches up the crew a little bit. We have the introduction of a new bad guy who is Mel Gibson, who, for me, it reminded me that, look, as much horrible or deplorable things that he has done or said in the past, and I know that was probably before, you start really canceling people, but it feels like he was like one of the earlier, before we called it that, he was one of those guys that he was just like out, like we just don't rock with him no more. But to see him in this kind of a role where he can really just eat it up and be the bad guy, be the villain, and just go to those weird, dark, disturbing places. It reminds me of like, oh yeah, he's still a real actor. I mean, he's got chops. He's not like these other guys. And on top of that, you add in new characters like Harrison Ford, Kelsey Grammer's in it for a little bit. Who else? Wesley Snipes, Antonio Banderas, who, the character that he plays is kind of annoying. He's just a motor mouth, just always talking, always excited. And yet it's a character. That's not him, right? So I feel like, all right, well, they're all doing something. And I just feel like this one at least worked a little better in terms of the dynamic. You've got more characters, and you've also got these younger guys, this new crew that is basically supposed to replace the older guys. And yet it turns out the older guys have to come in and save the day. So now you've got a bunch of new people involved. And look, I don't remember exactly the timing of this, but I feel like this was where we really first saw Glenn Powell, right? Before Top Gun Maverick, before any of the more recent movies that have been coming around. Here, like Stallone, the people that put this film together, they really tapped into something. They found this guy, I think. And maybe because a lot of people didn't see this film or it just wasn't as notable as the first one or the first two, maybe it kind of flew under the radar. But it was interesting to kind of see it now of like, oh, here, they were on this guy already. And that was back when this movie came out. So I got to say, like, for me, Expendables 3 is actually surprisingly better than I expected. I really thought, okay, we are steadily going downhill now. But that was actually a pretty solid, and that's the other thing. It felt more like a film. It felt like it had more of a plot and a real trajectory for all of the characters and what they were trying to do. I guess because the Mel Gibson character, he's not just a bad guy. He's kind of like someone from their past, and Barney's having to reconcile some things that happened before and basically take care of some old business, So that I'm okay with it. I actually liked Expendables 3 more than Expendables 2, maybe even a little more than Expendables 1. And I got to say, this last one that just recently came out, which is the fourth one, Expendables. That's the way it's spelled. I'm sorry. I don't know what to make of this movie. And then this is one where I legit thought, who asked for this movie? I mean, you got Stallone comes back, you got Statham, you've got some new additions in there. This wasn't so much a problem with the plot, even though I kind of don't really remember it. Even the characters, I mean, they try to pick up the same vibe, the same chemistry again. It doesn't quite always work because there's a point where Stallone is just out of the film and it's the rest of the crew working on their own now. And, besides all of that, I mean, from a filmmaking, just from a technical standpoint, this film is rough. There are some visual effects. First of all, too much CGI in this film. I think that's the original three films, the first three films. I think they tried to mostly ground it in real practical stunts and special effects and action. And in this third one or the fourth one, you can see like there's hints of that, but there's a lot of green screen use. There's a lot of CGI of like fake airplanes and vehicles, and it's just a lot of stuff. You can just see it. Like, this doesn't look legit, you know? In terms of the quality, this is not there. And it's one of those things where it makes you just wonder, like, why? Why did they even bother? You know, it doesn't really hold up in any regard to the earlier films. And so this one is definitely just a pass. I mean, I watched it just for the sake of being the completist, and it would bug me if I didn't watch them all, you know? That's just how I do, I guess. But man, so rough. I just didn't understand it. I just didn't understand the thinking of why make a movie like this and make it so badly. You know, it'd be one thing if, like, hey, you know, the technology, the cast, things have changed. We found a way to do this better. And this is like the opposite of that. It's almost like we found a way to do all this worse. So I don't know. I don't really see a future for the franchise, you know? I kind of feel like it should have been over already. So to make a fourth film, it's like, well, are you trying to set up another film, like a fifth one or a spinoff or something? I don't know. There's a part of me that enjoys this idea of throwback style films that really do take us to a different era of filmmaking, different types of characters and stories. And yet at the same time, it's like, but you're fighting with things that are out today. It's not like somebody dug these films up from the 80s of like, look, oh, there's these movies, The Expendables, that nobody really watched back in the day. And now they've kind of resurged. They've found a new audience or something. No, these are films that are made more recently and meant to, I think, throw back to that era. But you could say, well, I like my action movies big and dumb and loud. All right. I mean, that's fine. But I think that doesn't do anything to advance the form or advance the genre, right? And I mean, if we're just going to make the same movies that we made back in a previous era, why? Just let those movies be the movies. You know, if you would rather have Lethal Weapon or Die Hard or Missing in Action or Rambo, well, we have them already. We don't have to go make more movies like those. And not that all those movies were big and dumb and loud, but I'm just saying, if those were the templates, I mean, they're there already. They exist. I just don't know what to say about these films, you know? Because part of me is like, that's my era of action films. And so I appreciate some of the nods to those specific films from that era. Some of the genre tropes and cliches that they kind of play with. And even just the style of acting and the dialogue. I feel like, yeah, it kind of works in that vein. But as soon as you step outside of that and you're like, oh yeah, but there's that, but then there's also all these other movies by all these other filmmakers from today. And I don't know. It's a weird place to be in terms of the mindset of it. And all I could say is, I guess this is a thing that it's totally built and imagined by Sylvester Stallone, who's no slouch when it comes to this, right? He originally wrote Rocky, starred in Rocky, went on to build a franchise there, starred in First Blood, went on to build a franchise there with Rambo, has always, from my understanding, had a sense for not just being an actor, but being a filmmaker, being a storyteller, even to the Creed franchise and being a part of that, which you would think he almost would have not wanted to go back to that territory and yet went back and got the Oscar nomination, you know? Like, come on. So here's a guy who clearly knows, he has an eye for what works and what audiences want, and I appreciate that. And at the same time, it's like, look, as much as I like Stallone in something like Tango and Cash, it's fun. It's a big, dumb, loud action movie. You got two great actors at the front of it. He'll do something else like what was the comedy? Was it Oscar? Which, I didn't really understand the thinking there. I guess he wanted to show like I'm more than just, big muscly action guy. But is that really helping the cause any of the stories he's trying to tell, the filmmaker he's trying to be? And now, look, this is about the Expendables. It's not all about Stallone, of course, but he is kind of at the core of this whole thing. So I appreciate that in terms of the ambition of it. I feel like with these 4 films, at least, you see a lot of uneven quality. That's my take on that for now. I'll be back soon with another new episode. And if you want to hear some older episodes, you can go to filmstreak.com. You can find a list of all these films on IMDb. So maybe you haven't heard of some of these. Maybe you want to check some out. You can go to IMDb. That'll show you where you can find them online if you want to stream them. You can add them to your watch list. And, if you like to rate and review and all that stuff. This podcast, look, if you want to rate and review, on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you're listening to this, go ahead, do that. It's cool. If you don't like it, that's fine. I don't care. If you do like it, hey, thanks for listening. Thanks for stopping by for a little bit. Also, if you don't mind, if you're into it enough, maybe buy me a popcorn. Sitting here watching movies all the time, get a little hungry every once in a while, so could use a snack. Anyway, that's it for me for now. Stay safe and stay dry, stay cool, because it's hot out there. And go watch something new.